Hi, I'm Allie McDonald, Senior Editor at SMR, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Beth Berwick. Beth is a partner at Grads of Life, a subsidiary of Europe that works with companies to build inclusive talent practices. Today, she'll be discussing the why, what, and how of skills-based talent practices. And we'll have a few minutes at the end of Beth's presentation to answer questions. With that said, welcome, Beth.
Thank you so much, Allie, and thanks to Gerald for that great introduction. As Gerald mentioned, Grads of Life is a part of the broader organization Europe, and we are really focused on the employer side of the equation and see employers as the key levers for change to ensure that more people have access to good jobs. And that specifically includes those without four-year degrees. So we work directly with companies to implement skills-based talent practices in order to achieve this goal, which I'm excited to talk to you about today. So I'm sure many of you at this point have heard about skills-based employment, but it's really the idea of using skills rather than degrees to determine readiness for a role. It's a fast growing movement. I think it's sort of really part of the lexicon, especially in the last 6 months to a year in corporate America and beyond. And we've seen a huge number of businesses and even some states, as we see here, commit to hiring and promoting people based on skills rather than degrees. And this is a space that has been getting increasing momentum over the last several years. We released some research in 2017 called Dismissed by Degrees with Harvard Business School and Accenture that really talked about this idea of degree inflation that had been occurring, really where roles that used to not require four-year degrees all of a sudden were requiring them, where at many companies you were shut out of jobs that you previously wouldn't have been just because you did not have a college degree. And this momentum that is growing is really being pushed by companies, which is great. And we've seen a lot of employer coalitions led by 110 and the Business Roundtable make bold commitments around skills-based practices that have come to dominate the national conversation about HR. And from where I sit, this is obviously extremely exciting. And I think there's still a lot of work to do that we can talk a little bit about now. Businesses are moving quickly to adapt and figure out, what does this mean? What does this mean for my company? And how do we really do this? And when we hear skills-based practices, I think many people think it's really just about removing that degree requirement. And to be clear, that is a big piece of the work. You have to take that requirement off of job descriptions, and because it's excluding 64% of the population and including 76% of Black Americans and 80% of Latinos. But however, this approach goes far beyond just removing the degree requirements. And there are several changes to traditional practices and policies and company culture that need to happen for skills-based efforts to succeed. So yes, you need to remove the degree requirements, but you have to determine what are the skills that are required for this job, ensure that your hiring managers are on board. How do you transform your culture to ensure that degrees don't continue to be the proxies that folks are using, and also ensure that degrees aren't preventing you, not having a degree isn't preventing you from advancing. I think taking a skills-based approach to talent acquisition and talent management is common sense in many ways. And, I think many HR professionals realize they are using degrees as a proxy for certain skills, and that digging underneath to really get at what those skills are is just good practice generally. And you can understand that people can get those skills through, traditional routes such as a four-year degree or through other ways of finding those skills. So it also helps to reach many of the business objectives that companies have. I think that's important as we think about how do we get the buy-in, and how do we convince folks to make changes to how they operate? And so it creates a much more equitable and diverse workforce, as I talked about in some of the stats I used earlier. It helps lower the cost of hiring and make stronger hires. it also helps to strengthen organizational culture, retention, and advancement. And in the end, when lots of companies are doing this, it really creates social value. Communities see more economic opportunity and mobility. So it's about sort of business value and social value are sort of two sides of the coin there. As I mentioned, building a comprehensive skills-based organization is about much more than removing degree requirements. You will probably hear me say that throughout this talk, but it requires this changing along the spectrum of sourcing and recruiting, of hiring, of retention and advancement. And I won't read through this entire slide, but to call out a few pieces, I think in step 3 is the sourcing piece. How do you find the right talent? And even if you are to remove the degree requirement from your job descriptions, if you continue to source talent in the same way as you have previously, you will continue to get the same results. So this step is really about figuring out the skills and building the partnerships with talent developers and other organizations that train people without degrees into the careers that you're looking for. And you need to work with them to build this robust talent pipeline. Again, you have to think differently about where you're sourcing talent and how you're assessing the skills. And there's a lot of organizations, Europe obviously being one of them, that works with talent to develop those skills and can place them into roles within your organization. The other piece I want to call out here is this step 6 around skills-based professional development. So once you bring on skills-based hires, you have to make sure that they can advance within their company by growing their skills. And I think around 76% of all workers say that they are attracted to jobs where they are able to still gain more skills. So this upskilling piece is really critical, and you don't want sort of a stagnation at an entry-level workforce that may not have a 4-year degree and then has nowhere to go. So that's why it sort of goes beyond not just beyond removing the degree requirement, but beyond hiring. So once you bring folks in, where do they go next? So if this level doesn't require a degree, but the next level up does that prevent folks from moving up? So we've been working with a lot of companies on, okay, we have this large frontline workforce that we think have these certain skills based on the work we do with them, but to get into these other jobs, we do require that they have a 4-year degree. What do we do? How do we think about the skills that we're getting to our frontline workforce, and what jobs those people can grow into in order to progress in their career? We don't want it to sort of stop at that first hiring level and not think about what happens next, because there are real opportunities within your workforce already where it may not require going out for sourcing. And so I think this is something that a lot of companies we are seeing work on as they realize they have this entry-level workforce that they could use as a pool of talent for other jobs, but it requires identifying what skills they're getting in their job now, what skills might they need for these other jobs, and how do we get them from here to there. And the last one I'll call out is within step 7, which is really investing in something that we call mindset shift and internal storytelling. Skills-based hiring will lead you to a different workforce than you may currently have, and many non-traditional hires. So you have to make sure you invest in reducing bias and shifting mindsets to create that inclusive culture so that people stick around. So internal storytelling can be a key way to do that, and there are different things that will motivate and move different people, which I can talk about a little bit in my next slide. But the value of skills-based hiring and telling the stories of people within your workforce can be a really great place to start. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of examples of some companies that we have worked with that have done this. But before I do that, I want to highlight the importance of measuring the impact of these skills-based practices. So whether you are newly implementing these practices or they already exist, there are some key questions you can use as your North Star to continually assess how these efforts are helping your business and your employees. And again, to the storytelling piece that I just talked about, some people are motivated to change by data. So having this data and tracking when I made this change, this is what happened, can be really, really powerful in making sure there's buy-in throughout the company on this work, to ensuring that you're actually seeing an impact of what you're doing. Again, you have to ensure that you could take the degrees off the roles, but how are we ensuring this is actually changing our practices and we are getting the outcomes that we want through this work? So, I mean, one key piece to look at is what percentage of your job postings do not require a 4-year degree. Again, that's not the be all end all, but tracking that is really critical. And one of the companies that we work with, that answer was 90%. They removed degree requirements from almost all of their roles. And, they were in a business that they could do that, but it was IT, and they kept them for sort of like legal jobs. There were a couple that actually, needed to have some advanced degree requirements, but they removed them from a lot of their roles. And I think part of that is a communication too, right? That tells the company and people within the company, we're going to change the way we think about hiring broadly. And that, I think, just is a great first step as you think about the commitment of a company to make these changes. And then obviously looking at how this changes your diversity is another critical point. A lot of companies have diversity goals. And so thinking about how making this change may impact the diversity of your workforce is sort of a critical piece of that as well. So next, I will get into a couple of examples. So Cleveland Clinic, which many people probably know, is a world-class hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. And they joined the 110 Coalition at the beginning in 2020 and wanted to really think about how to increase the diversity of their workforce, and specifically thinking about Black employees in their workforce. So they took a skills-based approach to retain and hire more Black employees from the Cleveland community. And so after working with Grads of Life, to determine which roles to start with and where they had opportunity to shift key practices within their company, they launched 2 apprenticeship programs. In addition to that, from the apprenticeship programs, they defined skills-based career pathways. So that's, again, what I'm talking about. It's not just, the hiring, can't stop there. What's the pathway for folks that may come into their roles? And then they removed the degree requirements from over 2,000 roles. And as a result, they hired or promoted over 1,000 Black people into family-sustaining wage roles. And this was a huge accomplishment for the Cleveland Clinic. They have historically had a challenged relationship with the community in which they work, and they name this as a critical priority. And I think very importantly to name, it was named as a critical priority by senior leaders and specifically by their CEO. And that, I think, made a huge difference on the ability to actually implement this. And again, on creating the buy-in, on how do you make sure this change happens? How do you really get people to change the way they work? And they had said from the top, this is something we're going to do. This is a commitment we're going to make. How do we make this happen? And we came in to help them do that. So the next example I'm going to give is more around the culture and mindset shift that I mentioned earlier. So this is around Delta, which I assume many of you know. I took a lovely flight on Delta yesterday. They wanted to invest in their frontline managers, given their large frontline workforce. And I think all of us have seen the data and experienced in our own careers the importance of managers in the satisfaction and retention of employees. So as you think about buy-in and what do you need to do internally once you've removed degree requirements, once you've brought people into your workforce that may have a different background than those before, how are you ensuring they stay? How are you ensuring managers know why you're doing this? They're just such a critical group to make sure you get buy-in from as part of this work. And so we work with them to make sure they understood why are we doing this? What's the best way to manage this new talent that you're bringing into the workforce? So we at Grads of Life delivered a series of trainings for Delta's managers to help them better understand, again, the why behind this. What does this do? And what do I need to maybe do differently as a manager to ensure the effectiveness of this work? So that's sort of a little bit of the why, a little bit of the how, and some examples that they have. And Allie, I'm happy to take some questions from the group if anybody has any.
Well, thank you so much, Beth. That was a wonderful presentation. We've been getting a lot of great questions in the chat, and we have a couple more minutes, so feel free, folks, to submit your questions for Beth. But we did have a lot of questions come up about assessment. So in terms of making this big shift from degree-based, pay scales, and how are you aligning, how are you thinking about where measurement comes in here? Is it self-assessment? Is it certification? And how do companies sort of successfully move to new assessment measures rather than just relying on, degrees and kind of legacy approaches?
Yeah, I mean, so that's why I think the first step is this: how do we determine what skills we need, and what are some partnerships that we can create where that we know those skills are being developed, and then what can we do what are we training for internally? And so a lot of companies that we've worked with, again, some of them have taken their current workforce, so maybe their frontline workforce who may not have degrees, and said, here's a program that we're going to do, an apprenticeship program where we put you in a program where we think about like, what skills do you need to get there? Others, they're, partnerships with a variety of talent providers, with community colleges, different places. And I think the key first step is to think, what are we using that degree as a proxy for? Like, what do we really need people to have, and who can help us get talent that has that training, and what are we training for internally? So it does require this sort of upfront work to really define skills in jobs, to say, okay, this is what we need, and here's who we can go partner with, or here's how we would assess whether this person has that job. Here's what we know our frontline workforce has, because they work here. We know what they're developing. They're developing these great customer facing skills in retail. So what are other jobs within our company that need that? And then what are the 2 or 3 things we may need to build onto that? So, digging underneath the skills for the job, I think, is the important first step. And then you can figure out how are we assessing for those, either through partnerships or other things. But you don't want to create another assessment that's just another barrier, that's not a degree requirement, but something else that's sort of also preventing new talent from coming in.
Exactly. And so in terms of compensation too, like the shift that teams and HR organizations would have to go about, are you seeing, have you seen in some of the example companies any shifts away in terms of aligning pay scale more with skills versus years of experience or college degree?
Yes, exactly. I mean, you sort of think about it for role, and if this person is, good for this role, it doesn't matter that you're not paying for a degree versus skills. That's just a different way to achieve those skills. So, we definitely think of, what are good jobs, what are the, family sustaining wage jobs, and how are we ensuring that no matter the pathway to get there, you get that family sustaining wage.
That's great. And we had a question come in from one of the slides where you were walking through sort of different measures to take. And one was on sort of creating more equitable onboarding processes. And I'm just wondering how that is showing up.
Creating equitable onboarding?
Yes.
I mean, again, I think what are the skills we expect somebody to come into the role with? And then what are we going to provide them through onboarding, whether you have a degree or not? And then what additional training do we think people need? And so I think, again, we don't want to create 2 classes of workforce, right? That's not the idea. I think, the idea is just to think about what are different ways for people to achieve these skills. And then, what are we sort of adding on top of that to maybe support folks. I mean, we also talk a lot about sort of mentorship and sponsorship. A lot of reason I think the apprenticeship model is attractive to people. It's, bringing people in cohorts and providing them with real on the world experience. There are different ways that folks are thinking about, onboarding talent that may be different from what they normally bring in. But, I think underneath it all, why it's this skills-based approach is really thinking about what are the skills we expect people to come in with, what are we providing them, and then what do we help them to get to the next level.
Great. And I think we have about time for one more question. We had really great questions, but going back to sort of the mindset shift, leadership shifts, what advice do you have in terms of experience you may have had with working with other organizations in terms of overcoming resistance to this big shift?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's how folks decide to implement it. There are some companies that we work with, like I said, where they're like, we're going to remove degree requirements from 90% of our roles. This we want to do across the company. I mean, Delta has said that basically we're going to do this across the company. We need to figure out how to implement it. I think, in some cases it's, piloting it in certain roles, saying this is where we're going to start. And many times, the talent can speak for itself. And so managers can come and say, this is great. We love this program. And that can sort of build off of that original group that you go with. I mean, we talk about finding internal champions, like don't start with your hardest group, right? So some of it is, I think, depending on the culture of the organization, where they are, what your current workforce looks like, there's different ways to implement it. But I think figuring out what's the rollout plan for the broader, and I think depending on where you are, that could be start small and expand. It could be like we're going to do this broadly and push it out, and it depends a little bit on culture and how people want to roll it out.